In 1843, in the hills northeast of Mosul, a French consul named Paul-Émile Botta broke through a layer of packed earth and found himself standing in a room that had not been entered in over 2,500 years. The walls were lined with carved alabaster slabs, nearly 2 meters tall, and on those slabs, staring back at him with calm, ancient eyes, were figures unlike anything the modern world had ever seen. They had the bodies of men, but the heads of birds. They had wings folded against their backs, and in their hands each one held the same 2 objects, a small bucket in one hand and a pine cone in the other. Botta did not know what he was looking at. Neither did anyone else. Not yet. It would take decades of excavation, translation and argument before scholars could attach a name to these silent figures carved into the stone of an Assyrian king's palace. When that name finally came, it arrived in a language that had been dead for 2 millennia. The Akkadian word was Apkallu, and the tradition behind it reached back not centuries but millennia to the very beginning of everything the ancient world called civilization. Before the Anunnaki, before the great gods and their celestial councils, before the flood stories that would echo through every culture on Earth, there were 7 figures, 7 sages, 7 beings who, according to the oldest records humanity possesses, walked out of the water and into the dust of a world that did not yet know how to write, how to build, how to measure the stars, and they taught us everything. Tonight you do not need to remember any of this. You do not need to stay awake. Let your eyes close whenever they want to. Let your breathing slow. This story has been waiting for thousands of years. It can wait a little longer for you. And wherever sleep finds you along the way, in the dust of Eridu, in the halls of Nineveh, in the silence between the stars, that is exactly where you are meant to arrive. Let us begin where the Sumerians said it all began. At the edge of the water, in the oldest city in the world. There is a place in southern Iraq about 90 miles inland from the modern coastline of the Persian Gulf, where the desert flattens into a pale, salt-crusted plain. The air is dry, the light is punishing, nothing grows for miles, and rising from this emptiness, like a memory the earth cannot quite let go of, is a low, eroded mound of packed mud and broken brick. The Arabs call it Tel Abu Shahrin. Archaeologists call it Eridu. The Sumerians called it the first city. Not the first city they built or the first city they remembered. The first city full stop. The place where civilization began. The place where, according to the Sumerian king list, one of the oldest historical documents ever recovered, kingship itself descended from heaven, and the king it descended upon was a figure named Alulim, who ruled in Eridu for 28,800 years. That number is mythological, obviously, but the city beneath the myth is not. When Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd began their excavations at Tel Abu Shahrain in 1946, working under the Iraqi Directorate General of Antiquities, they expected to find old things. What they found instead was a puzzle that still has not been fully solved. They dug down through the mound, layer by careful layer, and identified 18 distinct strata of habitation. 18 layers of human life, stacked one on top of the other like pages in a book no one had read for 5,000 years. At the bottom of that stack, at the very base, sitting directly on virgin sand, was a small structure. A room, really, barely larger than a modern closet. It was made of sun-dried mud bricks, and it contained a niche in one wall that appeared to be an offering platform. There were fish bones scattered on the floor, and that was all. But here is what made Safar and Lloyd pause. This tiny structure, this humble room of mud and fish bones, dated to approximately 5,400 BC, and above it, in the layers that followed, each successive building grew larger, more complex, more architecturally sophisticated, until, by the Ubaid period, full temples stood on the site, with buttressed facades, central sanctuaries, and ritual platforms. The progression was orderly, almost too orderly, as if someone had drawn up plans and simply waited for the builders to catch up. The Sumerians had their own explanation for this. They said the god Enki lived beneath Eridu, in a place called the Abzu, the freshwater ocean that existed under the earth. Enki was the god of wisdom, of craft, of fresh water, and it was from the Abzu, from the deep, that he sent his messengers upward into the world of men. Those messengers were the Apkallu, the 7 sages. And the first among them, the one who rose from the waters before all the others, was called Uwana. The name Wana is Sumerian. In the Akkadian tradition, it was sometimes rendered as Yuan, and scholars have long debated its relationship to another famous figure, Adapa, the wise sage of Eridu. Some researchers believe Wana and Adapa are the same figure under different names. The compound Wana-Adapa appears in certain sage lists, while others argue they are distinct characters whose stories became entangled over time. The cuneiform sign for Adapa could also function as an adjective meaning wise, which may have encouraged their identification. In either case, when the Babylonian priest Berossus composed a 3-volume history of Babylonia in Greek, around 281 BC for the Seleucid king Antiochus I, he rendered the first sage's name as Oannes. It was through Berossus that the Western world first heard the story. His original books are lost, but fragments survive in the writings of later authors, Eusebius of Caesarea, Flavius Josephus, and Alexander Polyhista. And what those fragments describe is remarkable. According to Berossus, in the first year of creation, in the time of the very first king, a creature emerged from the Persian Gulf. It had the body of a fish, but beneath the fish's head was another head, a human one, and from beneath the fish's tail emerged human feet. It had a human voice, and every day this creature came ashore and taught the people who lived along the coast. It taught them writing, it taught them mathematics, it taught them how to build cities and found temples, it taught them how to make laws and measure land, it taught them how to plant seeds and harvest crops, and when the sun set, it returned to the sea. Berossus was writing in Greek for a Greek-speaking audience, and his account was filtered through several layers of translation and cultural reframing. But the core tradition he was drawing from was ancient, far older than his own era. And when cuneiform scholars began deciphering the clay tablets of Mesopotamia in the 19th and 20th centuries, they found the same tradition waiting for them, written in the wedge-shaped script of a civilization that had preceded Berossus by 2,000 years. The primary ancient sources for the Apkallu tradition are 3. The oldest preserved list appears in the Neo-Assyrian incantation series known as Bit Meseri, meaning quote 3, which the Assyriologist Raquel Borga identified as containing a complete catalogue of 7 antediluvian sages. The second is the Uruk list of kings and sages, a cuneiform tablet dated to approximately 165 BC, which pairs each sage with the antediluvian king he advised. And the third is Berossus himself. All 3 sources agree on the number, 7. All 3 agree on the basic sequence, and all 3 agree on the fundamental claim that these beings were not human, that they came from the water, and that they brought with them every art that made civilization possible. The names, as given in the Bit Meseri series and collated by scholars, run as follows. The first was Uwana, who finished the plans for heaven and earth. The second was Uwana-Duga, who was endowed with comprehensive intelligence. The third was Enma-Duga, who was allotted a good fate. The fourth was Enma-Galama, who was born in a house. The fifth was Enma-Buluga, who grew up on pasture land. The sixth was Anenlilda, the conjurer of the city of Eridu. And the seventh, the last sage before the flood, was Abzu, who ascended to heaven. Each sage served a different king, and the tradition as a whole attributed to them collectively the full range of knowledge that made civilization possible. When their work was done, 6 of the 7 appear to have returned to the Abzu, the deep from which they had come. But the 7th Abzu did not go back down. He went up. He ascended, says the text, directly to heaven. That detail matters. It will matter more later. For now, close your eyes if you have not already. Let the names settle. Uwana, Uwana-Duga, Enma-Duga, Enma-Galama, Enma-Buluga, Anenlilda, Abzu. 7 names from the bottom of the world's memory. 7 figures standing at the threshold between myth and history, between the water and the land, between silence and speech. Let us follow the first of them, the one the Greeks remembered as Oannes, and see what he left behind. The myth of Adapa is one of the oldest narratives in human literature. It survives on fragmentary clay tablets from at least 2 major sources, the Tel El Amarna archive in Egypt, where the largest and most important fragment, known as EA356, was discovered in 1887 by local Egyptians digging for fertilizer, and the Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, where British archaeologists Austin Henry Layard and Hormuzd Rassam unearthed additional pieces in the mid-19th century. A still earlier version, written in Sumerian, was found at Tel Hadad, ancient Maturin, and dated to between the 19th and 16th centuries BC. The Amarna tablet is particularly significant. It was found among the diplomatic correspondence of the Egyptian pharaoh Amenhotep IV, the king better known as Akhenaten, and dates to approximately the 14th century BC. The presence of a Mesopotamian myth in the archive of an Egyptian king tells us something important. This story travelled. It crossed borders, languages, and cultures. It was considered valuable enough to copy, to teach, to preserve in a foreign court hundreds of miles from where it originated. The story begins in Eridu. Adapa is a mortal man, wise beyond measure, but mortal. He serves as the priest of Enki's temple, performing the daily rituals that maintain cosmic order. He bakes the sacred bread. He fishes in the waters near the city. He is, in every sense, the perfect servant of the god of wisdom. One day, while fishing on the open water, a sudden gust of the south wind capsizes his boat. In his anger, Adapa speaks a curse, and the curse works. The wing of the south wind is broken. The wind ceases to blow. For 7 days the air is still. This catches the attention of Anu, the sky god, the highest authority in the Mesopotamian divine assembly. He summons Adapa to heaven to explain himself. But before Adapa ascends, Enki, his patron, his protector, the god who gave him his extraordinary wisdom, gives him a warning. When you arrive at the gate of heaven, Enki says, you will be met by 2 gods, Dumuzi and Gishzida. Mourn for them, for they have disappeared from the land. When you are brought before Anu, he will offer you bread and water. Do not eat, do not drink, for what he offers will be the bread of death and the water of death. Adapa obeys. He ascends to heaven. He mourns at the gate and wins the sympathy of its guardians. He is brought before Anu, and when Anu, impressed by the mortal's wisdom, perhaps moved by his plight, offers him the bread of life and the water of life, the very food that would grant him immortality, Adapa refuses. He follows his god's instruction. He turns away the gift, and Anu laughs. Or perhaps Anu sighs. The text is damaged at this point, and scholars have debated for over a century what the sky god's reaction actually was. But the result is clear. Adapa is sent back to Earth. He remains wise. He remains the sage of Eridu, but he remains mortal. The question that has haunted readers of this myth for more than 3,000 years is simple. Did Enki lie? Did the god of wisdom deliberately trick his most faithful servant out of eternal life? Or was it a genuine warning given in good faith that simply happened to be wrong? The text does not answer, and perhaps that silence is the point. What the myth does establish, what it encodes into the deepest layer of Mesopotamian thought, is a principle. Wisdom and immortality are not the same thing. You may have one, you may not have both. The gods drew a line, and even the greatest sage who ever lived could not cross it. This idea would echo forward through millennia. You can hear it in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where a king who is 2/3 divine searches the world for eternal life and comes home empty-handed. You can hear it in the book of Genesis, where a man and a woman eat from the tree of knowledge and are barred from the tree of life. You can hear it in Greek mythology, where Prometheus gives humanity the gift of fire and is punished for eternity. The pattern repeats. Knowledge is given. Immortality is withheld, and the giver always pays a price. A year. But Adapa's story is the oldest version we have, and in Adapa's story the giver is not punished. He simply goes home. He returns to Eridu, to the temple by the water, to the rituals and the fishing and the slow, patient work of passing along what he knows to those who will come after him. He becomes the first teacher, the prototype of the priestly class, the model for every sage who followed. And in the rituals of later Mesopotamian religion, his name became a word of power. Exorcists performing their rites would declare as a kind of invocation, "I am Adapa." They were not claiming to be him, they were claiming his authority, his connection to the deep, his unbroken line of knowledge stretching back to the moment when a figure rose from the water and began to speak. Now let us return to those carved slabs that greeted Paul-Émile Botta in 1843. The site was Dur-Sharrukin, the fortress of Sargon, a city built from nothing in the final decades of the 8th century BC by the Assyrian king Sargon-Dast. It was an extraordinary act of ambition, an entirely new capital constructed on a site where no buildings had ever stood before, its proportions based on mathematical harmony, its walls forming a nearly perfect square. Construction began around 717 BC. The city was inaugurated in 706 BC, and the following year Sargon II marched off on a campaign against Tabal in Anatolia, where he was killed in battle. His body was never recovered. His son Sennacherib, shaken by his father's fate and believing it to be a divine punishment for some unknowable sin, abandoned the new capital almost immediately and moved the court to Nineveh. Dur-Sharrukin fell silent. The city that had been built to last forever was occupied for barely a year. But the walls remained, and on those walls the Apkallu stood guard. The Dutch Assyriologist Frans Vigerman, in his landmark 1992 study Mesopotamian Protective Spirits, identified 3 distinct physical types of Apkallu depicted in Assyrian art. The first type is the fish-cloaked figure, a humanoid form draped in the skin of a carp, with the fish's head positioned above the human head like a ceremonial hood. This corresponds to the descriptions in Berossus and to the fish-garbed figures of earlier cylinder seals. The second type is the human-figured Apkallu, bearded, wingless, and dressed in long robes, often depicted carrying a bucket and a cone-shaped object. The third type is the bird-headed Apkallu, a winged figure with the head of an eagle, human arms and torso, and a bucket and cone in its hands. All 3 types appear at Dur-Sharrukin. They flank doorways. They stand beside the throne room. They line the corridors through which the king would have walked every day of his brief residence. And they were not merely decorative, they are functional. The Assyrians believed that the Apkallu possessed apotropaic power, the power to ward off evil. Placing their images at the entrances and boundaries of a building was a ritual act, a spiritual fortification as important as any physical wall. The Apkallu were guardians. They stood at the threshold between the known and the unknown, between the safe interior and the dangerous world beyond. Their presence declared, "This space is protected. The wisdom of the ancients stands watch here. Nothing unclean may pass." This belief was not unique to the palaces of kings. It extended into private homes, into temple precincts, into the very fabric of daily life. The Apkallu were everywhere, not as objects of worship, but as silent sentinels, protectors, keepers of order in a world that the Mesopotamians understood to be constantly threatened by chaos. And they were not only carved into walls, they were also buried beneath floors. Archaeological excavations at Nimrud, the Assyrian city of Kalhu, uncovered small clay figurines of Apkallu placed in foundation deposits under the floors of palaces and temples. These figurines, sometimes just a few inches tall, were arranged in specific patterns described in ritual texts. Fish-cloaked figures, bird-headed figures, human-figured sages, all placed face outward, toward the edges of the building, forming an invisible perimeter of protection that lay hidden beneath the feet of everyone who walked above. The ritual texts that describe these practices are precise. They specify the materials, clay mixed with certain minerals. They specify the colours, sometimes red, sometimes white, sometimes black. They specify the number of figurines and their placement, and they specify the incantations to be recited during their burial. This was not casual superstition. This was technology. Spiritual technology, certainly. But technology nonetheless. Systematic, repeatable, and rooted in a tradition that the Assyrians traced back to the very beginning of civilization, back to the 7 sages, back to the water. The research document from which this narrative draws contains a striking claim that the Apkallu did not simply arrive and teach in general terms, they arrived with a curriculum. Now, the word curriculum is modern, and we must be careful. The ancient texts do not describe a structured educational program in the way a modern university would, but they do describe something remarkable, a collective body of knowledge attributed to the sages as a group, encompassing virtually every domain that the Mesopotamians considered essential to civilized life. According to the tradition, the knowledge brought by the Apkallu encompassed at least the following areas: writing and the scribble arts, mathematics, including the sexagesimal system, the base 60 counting system that we still use today when we measure time in 60-second minutes and 60-minute hours, and when we divide a circle into 360 degrees, astronomy, including the tracking of planetary movements, the prediction of eclipses, and the mapping of star patterns, architecture, including the principles of temple construction and the proportional systems used to design ziggurats, metallurgy, including the smelting of copper and tin and the creation of bronze alloys. Medicine, including the preparation of pharmaceutical compounds and the practice of surgical procedures. Agriculture, including irrigation engineering and the management of crop cycles. Divination, including the reading of animal organs, the interpretation of dreams, and the observation of bird flight patterns. And law, including the establishment of legal codes and contractual obligations. This is not a short list, and some of it is verifiable. The sexagesimal system, for instance, is one of the most sophisticated mathematical innovations of the ancient world. It appears in Mesopotamian texts from at least the 3rd millennium BC, and it enabled calculations of a complexity that would not be matched elsewhere for centuries. Babylonian mathematicians could solve quadratic equations. They understood the relationship between the sides of a right triangle, what we call the Pythagorean theorem, more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. The tablet known as Plimpton 322, housed at Columbia University, contains a table of Pythagorean triples dating to approximately 1800 BC. It is evidence of a mathematical tradition so advanced that modern scholars have spent decades debating its full implications. Babylonian astronomers, building on this mathematical foundation, achieved feats of observational precision that are still remarkable today. They tracked the movements of Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn with enough accuracy to predict their future positions. They developed methods for predicting lunar and solar eclipses. The astronomical diaries they maintained, continuous records of celestial observations, constitute the longest sustained scientific data collection effort in human history, spanning several centuries from at least the 7th century BC onward. The Sumerians and Babylonians attributed all of this. The numbers, the stars, the geometry, the prediction of things that had not yet happened, to the sages who came from the water. And at Eridu, the archaeological record offers a tantalizing parallel. The sequence of temples that Safar and Lloyd uncovered, those 18 layers stacked one upon another, shows a progression from the simplest possible structure to a complex religious and administrative centre. But that progression is not chaotic. It is orderly. Each new layer builds on the one before it, incorporating new techniques, new materials, new principles of design. As if someone were following a plan, as if someone were teaching. This does not prove that fish-cloaked sages emerged from the Persian Gulf and held classes in temple construction. But it does suggest that the Sumerians themselves experienced their own cultural development as something that came to them, something given rather than discovered. And they encoded that experience in the most powerful language they had, myth. Let your mind settle with that thought. The ancients looked at what they had built. The cities, the temples, the irrigation canals, the written language, the mathematics. And they could not explain it as something they had invented. It was too much, too fast, too sophisticated. It must have come from somewhere else, from someone else, from the deep. Whether that intuition was memory or metaphor we may never know, but the question itself is worth holding gently as you drift. In the late 1840s and 1850s, British archaeologists, first Austin Henry Layard, then his assistant Hormuzd Rassam, were excavating at Kuyunjik, the great mound that covered the ruins of ancient Nineveh. Over the course of years of digging, they uncovered what would become one of the most important discoveries in the history of archaeology, the Library of Ashurbanipal. Ashurbanipal was the last great king of the Assyrian Empire, ruling from approximately 668 to 626 BC. He was a warrior, certainly. The Assyrians were always warriors, but he was also something unusual for a king of his era. He was a scholar. In his own inscriptions, he boasted of his ability to read and write cuneiform, a skill that was typically reserved for professional scribes. He claimed to have mastered the arts of divination and exorcism, and he styled himself, in a phrase that reaches directly back to the Apkallu tradition, as one who had grasped the craft of Adapa. That phrase is significant. It means that in the 7th century BC, more than 2,000 years after the mythological period in which the sages were said to have lived, the name of the first Apkallu was still being invoked as the highest standard of wisdom. The craft of Adapa was not a dead tradition. It was a living claim to intellectual authority, and Ashurbanipal did not merely invoke that authority. He collected it. He sent scribes to every corner of his empire, to temples, to libraries, to private collections, with orders to copy or confiscate every text they could find. The result was a library of more than 30,000 cuneiform tablets, covering virtually every domain of Mesopotamian knowledge: mathematics, astronomy, medicine, divination, literature, law, ritual, mythology, and history. Among those tablets were the most complete surviving versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish creation myth, the Atrahasis flood narrative, and, crucially, the incantation series Bit Meseri, which contains the fullest surviving list of the 7 Apkallu and the ritual instructions for their protective deployment. When George Smith, a self-taught Assyriologist working at the British Museum, translated the flood narrative from Ashurbanipal's library in 1872, it caused a sensation. The parallels to the biblical story of Noah were unmistakable. A man warned by a god, a great boat, a flood that destroys the world, animals brought aboard for preservation, a bird released to find dry land. The story was older than Genesis by more than a millennium, but the flood story was only one thread in a much larger tapestry. The Apkallu tradition was another, and it pointed not forward to the Bible but backward, to the very origin of the idea that knowledge is sacred, that it comes from a source beyond the human, and that the duty of the wise is to preserve it against catastrophe. For the Mesopotamian texts are explicit on this point. The sages knew the flood was coming, and they made preparations. The flood narrative in Mesopotamian literature is not a single story. It is a family of stories, each telling a slightly different version of the same event, each emphasizing different elements. In the Atrahasis epic, the oldest extended version, dating to approximately 1700 BC, the gods decide to destroy humanity because the noise of human civilization has become unbearable. Enlil, the god of wind and storm, decrees the flood, but Enki, the god of wisdom, warns a mortal man, Atrahasis, the exceedingly wise, and instructs him to build a boat and save his family, his craftsmen, and the seed of all living things. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the survivor is called Utnapishtim. The story is essentially the same, but told in retrospect. Utnapishtim recounts the flood to Gilgamesh, who has sought him out in his quest for immortality. And in the oldest Sumerian version, the survivor is Ziusudra. Some scholars have pointed to passages in later Mesopotamian flood traditions that appear to reference not only the saving of biological life, but also the deliberate preservation of written knowledge and the implements of civilization, though the surviving Sumerian text is highly fragmentary, and the precise details of what was saved vary across different versions of the story. This detail matters enormously. The Sumerians were not just telling a story about surviving a natural disaster. They were telling a story about preserving knowledge. The flood was a threat not only to bodies, but to minds, not only to people, but to everything people knew. And the Apkallu were at the centre of that preservation effort. The tradition holds that the sages played a role in protecting accumulated knowledge before the anticipated deluge. Some later interpretations describe the seventh sage, Abzu, as having coordinated these preservation efforts, travelling between the antediluvian cities to ensure that essential knowledge would survive. Multiple cities are described in various texts as having had repositories prepared, sealed chambers containing cuneiform tablets, tools, and other objects, waterproofed with bitumen and buried beneath temple foundations. How much of this represents genuine ancient tradition, and how much is later elaboration is difficult to determine with certainty. How much of this is mythology? How much is memory? The boundary is not as clear as we might like. At Tel Farum, the ancient city of Shuruppak, home of the flood hero Ziusudra, archaeologists found what appears to be a flood stratum, a layer of water-laid sediment, reportedly several feet thick, separating the layers of human habitation below from those above. It contains deposits consistent with a significant inundation. Similar flood layers have been found at Ur and Kish, though they do not all date to the same period, which could suggest either multiple flood events at different times or a single regional catastrophe whose effects varied by location. The precise nature and date of these flood deposits remains debated among scholars. Marine geological cores from the Persian Gulf tell a complementary story. Around 5,500 BC, sea levels rose significantly and rapidly, likely the result of glacial meltwater barriers being breached, sending enormous volumes of fresh water into the Gulf. Sites that had once been on dry land, fishing villages, perhaps small towns, were submerged. Robert Carter, an archaeologist who has conducted surveys off the coast of Kuwait, has identified more than 60 submerged archaeological sites, dating from approximately 8,000 to 4,000 BC. Some of these sites, now lying as deep as 16 metres below sea level, show intriguing evidence of organised settlement patterns, what appear to be stone foundations in deliberate configurations, ceramic fragments suggesting kiln technology. Based on what has been documented so far, these seem to be the remains of communities that were considerably more organised than simple fishing camps, though the limited nature of underwater archaeology in the Gulf means that definitive conclusions remain elusive. If these sites represent what they appear to represent, they are the remains of communities that were swallowed by the sea. Communities that may have possessed knowledge and organisational capacities we have only begun to glimpse. When the waters rose, those communities disappeared. The people who survived would have moved inland, carrying with them whatever they could: tools, seeds, memories, stories. And perhaps, if the Apkallu tradition contains even a grain of historical memory, they carried something else: practical knowledge, technical skills, an understanding of the world that had been developed over generations in a land that no longer existed. And on the other side of the inundation, in the cities that eventually rose along the rivers of southern Mesopotamia, sophisticated knowledge appeared. How quickly it appeared, and how much of it might have been inherited rather than independently developed, are questions that remain vigorously debated among archaeologists. Later Sumerian traditions appear to describe something like a rediscovery of the arts, a belief that post-flood rulers organised efforts to recover knowledge that had been deliberately preserved before the deluge. Let that thought settle over you like a warm blanket. Somewhere, in the deep past, someone looked at the world they had rebuilt and asked, "Where did we learn all this?" And the answer they gave was, "We remembered. We dug it up. We found what the sages had hidden." Whether that is literal or metaphorical, it is one of the most human stories ever told. Let us return for a moment to the carved figures on the walls of Assyrian palaces. We said there were 3 types. Let us look at each more carefully. The fish-cloaked Apkallu is the oldest form. In this depiction, the sage wears the entire skin of a large fish, probably the carp, identified in Akkadian as the Puruda fish, draped over his body like a cloak. The fish's head sits atop the human head, staring forward with empty eyes. The fish's tail hangs down the back. The effect is strange, almost unsettling. A human figure encased in something aquatic, something that belongs to a different element. This form corresponds directly to the descriptions in Berossus and to the earliest mythological texts. It represents the sage as an emissary of the Abzu, the freshwater deep. It says, "I come from the water. I carry the wisdom of the deep. I am not entirely of your world." The human-figured Apkallu is the most serene. He appears as a bearded man in long, elaborately decorated robes. He is always bearded. He never has wings. He carries the bucket and the cone. In the reliefs at Nimrud, the palace of Ashurbanipal II, who reigned from 883 to 859 BC, these figures are depicted with extraordinary care. The curls of their beards are individually carved. The fringes of their garments are rendered thread by thread. They have a stillness about them, a gravity, that sets them apart from the warriors and hunters depicted elsewhere on the same walls. This form represents the sage as teacher, as the one who has crossed from the divine realm into the human world and taken on human appearance to do his work. He is the civilizer, the lawgiver, the one who stands beside the king and whispers the knowledge of heaven into a mortal ear. The bird-headed Apkallu is the most dramatic. Winged with the head of an eagle and the body of a man, he towers over the doorways of royal chambers. His feathers are carved in meticulous rows. His talons grip the earth. And in his hands, always, invariably, the same objects, the bucket and the cone. The meaning of the bucket and cone has been debated extensively. The most widely accepted interpretation is that they represent a purification ritual. The bucket, known in Akkadian as the bandudu, held holy water or sacred oils. The cone, perhaps a pine cone, perhaps a date palm spathe, was dipped into the liquid and used to sprinkle or anoint. Chemical analysis of residues found in ceremonial vessels from the period has identified the presence of oils and aromatic resins, which is consistent with this interpretation. But there is another reading, one that is less certain but more evocative. Some scholars have suggested that the cone represents the pineal gland, the small cone-shaped structure in the centre of the human brain that has been associated, in traditions from ancient Egypt to Renaissance alchemy to modern alternative thought, with spiritual awakening and higher consciousness. Under this interpretation, the gesture of the Apkallu, touching the cone to the bucket, lifting it toward a human figure or a sacred tree, becomes an act of illumination, of opening, of transferring not just knowledge but awareness. This interpretation is speculative. It is not supported by direct textual evidence from the cuneiform record, but it has a certain resonance that is difficult to dismiss entirely, especially when one considers how many cultures, separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years, have independently associated a cone-shaped symbol with wisdom, enlightenment, and the awakening of hidden faculties. The three forms of the Apkallu taken together tell a story of their own. The fish-cloaked sage comes from the water, from the origin, from the deep. The human-figured sage walks among us, teaching, guiding, establishing the arts of civilization. The bird-headed sage has wings. He's capable of ascent, of leaving the earth behind, of returning to the heavens from which the tradition ultimately derives. Water, earth, air, three elements, three stages of a journey, and at the centre of all three, the act of passing something precious from one hand to another. Not all the stories about the Apkallu are gentle. The Era epic, also known as the Poem of Era, is a Babylonian literary text dating to approximately the 8th century BC, though it draws on older traditions. It tells the story of Era, a god of plague and destruction who convinces the supreme god Marduk to leave his temple in Babylon. With Marduk absent, chaos erupts. War, disease, and social collapse sweep the land. In the course of this narrative, Marduk makes a striking statement about the Apkallu. He says, "I made those Umanu go down to the Abzu, and I said they were not to come back." Umanu is the Akkadian term for expert or scholar. In this context, it refers to the Apkallu, or at least to the post-flood sages who carried on their tradition. And Marduk's statement is a banishment. He sent them back to the deep. He told them not to return. Why? The text does not give a clear reason, but the implication is unsettling. The sages were removed. Their direct presence in the human world was ended. And after their removal, the text says, the quality of craftsmanship declined. The images of the gods could no longer be renewed to their former perfection. The connection between the divine source of knowledge and the human artisans who depended on it was severed. This is a narrative of loss, not a sudden catastrophe like the flood, but a quieter, more insidious deterioration. The sages are gone. Their knowledge remains in the form of written texts and oral traditions. But the living presence, the direct transmission from teacher to student, from divine mind to human hand, has been withdrawn, and the world, says the text, is diminished because of it. There is something profoundly melancholy about this idea, that civilization reached its highest point not through its own efforts, but through contact with something greater, and that when that contact was broken, the slow decline began. Whether you read this as mythology, as allegory, or as some distant echo of a real historical transition, the emotional truth of it is hard to deny. Every culture has some version of this feeling, that the golden age is behind us, that the masters of old knew things we have forgotten, that the wellspring of true knowledge has dried up and left us working from copies of copies of copies. The Mesopotamians felt it too, and they located the source of that feeling in a specific moment, the banishment of the sages. Let that thought rest. It does not need to be resolved tonight. It only needs to be noticed. Here is where the story opens into something larger, something that, if you're still awake, might make the hair on your arm stand on end, not from fear, but from the sheer strangeness of the pattern. The Sumerians had 7 sages who came from the divine realm to teach humanity the arts of civilization, 7 beings of more than human origin, dispatched to Earth in the time before the flood, each carrying a specific domain of knowledge. Now consider the Saptarishi of ancient India. In the Vedic tradition, the oldest religious and philosophical system of the Indian subcontinent, there exist 7 primordial sages, collectively known as the Saptarishi. The word itself is Sanskrit. Sapta means 7, and Rishi means sage or seer. According to the tradition recorded in texts like the Jaiminiya Brahmana, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, and the Puranas, these 7 sages were the mind-born sons of Brahma, the creator god, and were entrusted with preserving cosmic order and transmitting sacred knowledge to humanity. The earliest formal list of the Saptarishi, as given in the Jaiminiya Brahmana, includes Agastya, Atri, Bharadvaja, Gautama, Jamadagni, Vasishtha, and Vishvamitra. Later lists vary. The names shift depending on the source and the cosmic age being described, but the number remains constant. Always 7, always sages, always bearers of knowledge from a higher source. The parallels with the Apkallu are worth pausing over. Both traditions describe 7 beings of divine or semi-divine origin. Both place these sages in a primordial era, before recorded history, before the current age of humanity. Both describe their primary function as the transmission of knowledge essential to civilization: astronomy, mathematics, agriculture, religious ritual. And both traditions include a catastrophic event: a flood in Mesopotamia, a pralaya or cosmic dissolution in Vedic cosmology, after which the sages' role changes. In Mesopotamia, the post-flood scholars are called Manu rather than Apkallu. They are human experts, not divine beings. In India, the second generation of Saptarishi includes sages of earthly origin, who attained divine status through their austerities. The Vedic convention, as some scholars have observed, thus mirrors that of Mesopotamia in structure: 7 antediluvian sages of divine origin, followed by earthly scholars in the post-catastrophe period. Whether this reflects direct cultural contact, parallel development, or some deeper shared tradition remains an open question. Now consider Egypt. The historian Manetho, writing in the 3rd century BC, described a period of Egyptian history that preceded the dynastic pharaohs. In his account, divine beings, the Shemsu Hor, or followers of Horus, governed Egypt for thousands of years before human rulers took the throne. The Turin King List, an ancient papyrus now housed in the Egyptian Museum in Turin, Italy, appears to support this tradition, listing reigns of extraordinary length for these pre-dynastic rulers. The pyramid texts, the oldest religious writings found in Egypt, inscribed on the walls of burial chambers in the pyramids at Saqqara, contain references to primeval beings who established cosmic order. While the Egyptian tradition does not map as neatly onto the 7-sage pattern as the Vedic one does, there are suggestive echoes, references to groups of divine beings associated with the origins of knowledge, and to a pre-dynastic era when gods, rather than men, ruled the land. And then there is Greece. Plato, writing around 387 BC, was the first to list the 7 wise men of Greece, historical figures from the Archaic period: Thales of Miletus, Pittacus of Mytilene, Bias of Priene, Solon of Athens, Cleobulus of Lindos, Myson of Chanae, and Chilon of Sparta. Later lists substituted other names: Periander, Pythagoras, but the number remained. 7 wise men, 7 bearers of knowledge that transformed Greek civilization. The Greek sages were historical figures, not mythological ones. They lived in the 6th and 7th centuries BC. They did not emerge from the sea or descend from heaven. But the structure of the tradition, 7 culture bearers whose collective wisdom defined the foundations of a civilization, is unmistakable. And scholars have noted the possibility that the Greek tradition was influenced by Mesopotamian models. The spread of cuneiform culture westward during the 1st and 2nd millennia BC is well documented. Trade routes connected the cities of Mesopotamia with the coastal cultures of the eastern Mediterranean. Astronomical knowledge, mathematical systems, and mythological motifs travelled along those routes. It is not unreasonable to suggest that the concept of 7 foundational sages travelled with them. The question is not whether these traditions are identical. They are not. The Apkallu are fish-cloaked beings who rise from the Abzu. The Saptarishi are luminous seers born from the mind of Brahma. The 7 wise men of Greece are flesh-and-blood philosophers who lived in historical cities. The question is why the number 7 keeps appearing. Why the structure keeps repeating. Why cultures separated by thousands of miles and hundreds of years all independently arrived at the same narrative architecture. 7 figures at the beginning of civilization carrying knowledge from a higher source. Perhaps it is coincidence. Perhaps it is cultural diffusion, one tradition influencing another across trade routes and migration paths. Or perhaps it points to something deeper, a shared human intuition about how knowledge works, that it does not emerge gradually from the darkness, that it arrives, that it is given, that it comes in the form of a teacher who knows things you do not, who has been somewhere you have not been, who carries in their hands the tools to reshape the world. You do not need to decide tonight which explanation is correct. The pattern itself is enough. Let it sit with you. Let it hum quietly at the edge of your awareness as you settle deeper into wherever you are resting. 7 sages, 7 stars in the Big Dipper, which the Indians call the Saptarishi Mandala, the constellation of the 7 sages, 7 notes in a musical scale, 7 colours in a rainbow, 7 days in a week. The number keeps appearing, and the story keeps being told. There is one more tradition that demands attention, and it is the one that bridges the ancient Near East and the biblical world most directly. The Book of Enoch, more precisely First Enoch, also called the Ethiopic Book of Enoch, is a Jewish religious text that survives in its complete form only in the Ge'ez language of Ethiopia. It is based on older Aramaic and Hebrew traditions, fragments of which were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls at Qumran, discovered in caves overlooking the Dead Sea between 1947 and 1956. Those Aramaic fragments date to the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC, making them among the oldest Jewish religious texts outside the Hebrew Bible itself. The complete Book of Enoch is not part of the standard biblical canon for most Christian or Jewish traditions, but it was enormously influential in the Second Temple period and is considered canonical by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The Book of Enoch describes a group of beings called the Watchers, 200 angels who descended to earth and, against divine instruction, began teaching humanity forbidden knowledge. Among the Watchers, specific figures are assigned specific domains of teaching. Azazel teaches metallurgy and the making of weapons and ornaments. Semjaza, the leader of the descent, is associated with the teaching of enchantments and herbal knowledge. Barakiel teaches astronomical observation and astrology. Kokabiel teaches the reading of the constellations. Arakiel teaches the signs of the earth. Shamsiel teaches the signs of the sun. The overlap with the Apkallu tradition is difficult to ignore. In both cases, supernatural beings descend to earth and teach humanity specific arts and sciences. In both cases, the knowledge they transmit includes metallurgy, astronomy, medicine, and divination. In both cases, their teaching is associated with a catastrophic aftermath. In the Enochic tradition, the violence and corruption that leads to the great flood that destroys the world of the Watcher's making. But there is a critical difference. In the Mesopotamian tradition, the Apkallu are sent by Enki. They are authorized emissaries of a benevolent god, and their teaching is a gift. It is sanctioned. It is part of the divine plan for humanity's development. In the Enochic tradition, the Watchers act against divine will. Their teaching is a transgression, and the knowledge they impart is described as quote, _0__. It is not a gift but a corruption. It leads not to civilization but to chaos. The same act, the transmission of advanced knowledge to humanity, is blessing in one tradition and curse in another. The same knowledge, metallurgy, astronomy, botany, is divine wisdom in one framework and forbidden secret in the other. This inversion is theologically significant. It reflects a fundamentally different understanding of the relationship between knowledge and divine authority. In the Mesopotamian world, the gods wanted humanity to learn. In the Enochic world, certain knowledge was never meant for human minds. The boundary between the divine and the human was not meant to be crossed, and crossing it brought catastrophe. Scholars have speculated extensively about the relationship between these traditions. Alan Lenzi, of the University of the Pacific, published a detailed analysis of the parallels in the Journal of Ancient Near Eastern Religions. The general consensus is that the Enochic Watcher tradition was influenced by Mesopotamian models, that Jewish writers of the Second Temple period, living in a world deeply shaped by Babylonian culture in the aftermath of the Babylonian exile, adapted the Apkallu motif but reframed it through a different theological lens. The sages became angels, the teaching became transgression, the gift became a fall, and here is the detail that binds the two traditions most tightly: Enoch himself. In Genesis 5, Enoch is described as the 7th from Adam, the 7th in the line of antediluvian patriarchs. He is said to have quote 1, and instead of dying, he quote 2, he ascended to heaven, the 7th sage, who ascended to heaven, just like Abzu, the 7th Apkallu, who, unlike his predecessors, did not return to the Abzu but ascended directly to the sky. It is difficult to read this parallel as mere coincidence. The 7th figure in a line of pre-flood sages, distinguished from the others by ascending to heaven, this motif appears in both Mesopotamian and biblical tradition, and its presence in both suggests either a common source or a direct literary influence. The nature of that influence, which direction it travelled, how it was transformed, what was added and what was lost, is a question for scholars, and they continue to debate it. But for our purposes tonight, the important thing is the shape of the pattern, the conviction, shared across cultures and centuries, that at the very beginning of human civilization, there was contact between the human world and something else, something higher, something that taught, and then withdrew, and that the memory of that contact, imperfect, fragmented, coloured by each culture's own theological and philosophical concerns, persisted for thousands of years. There is a third domain of Apkallu knowledge that deserves its own space in this story, and it is one that changed the physical world as profoundly as writing changed the intellectual one: metallurgy. The transition from stone tools to metal tools is one of the most consequential technological shifts in human history. It did not happen suddenly. There were centuries of experimentation with native copper, cold hammered into simple shapes. But when the full technology of smelting arrived, it arrived with force. Smelting requires heat, sustained, intense, controlled heat, well above what an open fire can produce. It requires knowledge of ores, the ability to recognize which rocks contain metal and which do not. It requires furnace design, enclosed chambers with air supplies that can be regulated to maintain specific temperatures, and it requires alloying, the understanding that combining two metals in specific proportions produces a third material with properties superior to either. Bronze, the alloy of copper and tin, was the defining material of the ancient world for more than 2,000 years. It was harder than copper, held a sharper edge, and could be cast into complex shapes. It made possible better tools, better weapons, better agricultural implements. It transformed warfare, agriculture, construction, and art. And the Mesopotamians attributed the knowledge of metallurgy to the Apkallu. Some later traditions appear to associate metalworking particularly with the second sage, Uruk, who was endowed with comprehensive intelligence, though the cuneiform sources do not always assign specific knowledge domains to individual sages with the precision we might wish for. The archaeological evidence from early Mesopotamian sites shows a pattern worth noting. At sites like Bad Tibira, one of the 5 antediluvian cities listed in the Sumerian king list, there is evidence of early metalworking activity, though the precise level of sophistication relative to surrounding regions remains a matter of scholarly discussion. One of the most intriguing pieces of evidence comes from a much later source. The Kanesh archives, a collection of more than 23,000 cuneiform tablets, recovered from the ancient Assyrian trading colony at Kultepe in central Turkey, dating to the Old Assyrian period, roughly 1950 to 1740 BC, contain commercial records that document the trade in metals, textiles, and other goods between Assyria and Anatolia. Among these tablets, researchers have reported finding references to tablets of the first sages being purchased from Babylonian temple archives. One tablet, catalogued as KT94/K1050 and studied by the Turkish Assyriologist Kahit Gunbati, appears to record a merchant's account of acquiring such texts, and certain bronze working techniques are described in the archives using phrasing that seems to invoke the name of one of the Apkallu, what may be a variant spelling of Uruk, the second sage. If these readings are correct, and the interpretation of old Assyrian commercial texts is a specialized field where details are still being debated, then it would mean that in the 19th century BC, more than 2,000 years after the mythological period of the sages, Mesopotamian merchants were still invoking specific Apkallu names when describing technical processes. The tradition would not have been merely a religious or literary phenomenon. It would have been a commercial one. The knowledge of the sages would have had practical economic value, and chemical analysis of bronze artifacts from the period has shown that the alloy compositions described in various Mesopotamian technical texts correspond to real metallurgical formulas that produce functional bronze. The recipes, whatever their attributed origin, were technically sound. The mastery of fire and metal is not a small thing. It requires a deep understanding of materials science, of how different substances behave under different conditions of heat, pressure, and combination. It requires patience, experimentation, and the accumulation of knowledge across many generations. And it requires a means of transmitting that knowledge, of teaching the next generation how to recognize the right ore, how to build the right furnace, how to achieve the right temperature, how to mix the right proportions. The Apkallu tradition says that all of this was given, not discovered. That a being of more than human origin carried the knowledge of fire and metal from the divine realm to the human world, and that human metalworkers ever after were working from a template they did not create. Whether you accept that literally or see it as a cultural metaphor for the accumulated experience of countless unnamed artisans, the reverence is real. The Mesopotamians regarded their metallurgical knowledge as sacred. They treated it as something received, something inherited, something that demanded respect and careful stewardship, and they were not wrong to feel that way. The knowledge of how to work metal has been one of the foundations of human civilization. It has built tools and weapons and cities and machines. It has shaped the course of history in ways that are almost impossible to overstate. And it began, or so the oldest tradition says, with a sage who came from the water and taught us how to make fire serve our purposes. The Kenesh evidence opens a window onto something that is often overlooked in discussions of the Apkallu tradition, its economic dimension. The ancient Near East was not a collection of isolated civilizations. It was a network. Trade routes connected Sumer to Egypt, Anatolia to the Indus Valley, the Mediterranean coast to the highland plateaus of Iran. Along those routes travelled not only goods, copper and tin, gold and lapis lazuli, wool and grain, but also ideas, stories, techniques and beliefs. The Kenesh tablets show that knowledge itself was a commodity. Temple archives functioned not only as religious repositories, but as intellectual treasuries. The tablets of the first sages mentioned in the commercial records were not relics kept behind locked doors. They were copied, traded, and sold. Their contents were applied to practical problems, metallurgy, architecture, medicine, and the attribution to the Apkallu served as a kind of quality guarantee, a brand, if you will. If a technique was described as coming from the sages, it carried the authority of the oldest and most respected source of knowledge in the Mesopotamian world. This commercial dimension helps explain why the Apkallu tradition persisted for so long. It was not sustained solely by religious piety or literary tradition. It was sustained by practical value. The knowledge attributed to the sages worked. The metallurgical formulas produced good bronze. The astronomical calculations predicted eclipses. The medical recipes alleviated symptoms. The architectural proportions produced stable buildings. In a world where the alternative to good knowledge was often catastrophic failure, a collapsed building, a miscalculated eclipse, a poisonous rather than healing compound, the authority of the sages was not merely prestigious. It was essential. It was a matter of life and death, and so the tradition was maintained, century after century, dynasty after dynasty, empire after empire. The political landscape of Mesopotamia changed constantly. Sumer gave way to Akkad, Akkad to Babylon, Babylon to Assyria, Assyria to Persia. But the Apkallu tradition survived them all. It outlasted every king and every kingdom. It was the longest-lived intellectual tradition in the ancient world. Let that thought carry you. In a world of constant change, of wars and floods and the rise and fall of empires, one idea endured, that at the very beginning, 7 beings came from the water and taught us how to be human, and the knowledge they brought was worth preserving, worth passing on, worth fighting for. That idea outlasted bronze. It outlasted cuneiform. It outlasted the very civilizations that first expressed it. And in a quieter, more diffuse form, it persists today. In every classroom, every laboratory, every library, every moment when someone turns to another person and says, "Let me show you how this works." Let us follow the thread forward now. Out of Mesopotamia, through the centuries, into lands and languages the original Sumerian scribes could never have imagined. In the year 1000 AD, more than 3,000 years after the mythological period of the Apkallu, an Islamic scholar named Abu Rayhan al-Biruni completed a remarkable work called The Chronology of Ancient Nations. Al-Biruni was one of the most extraordinary intellects of the medieval world, a mathematician, astronomer, historian, and comparative religionist who wrote in Arabic and could read Sanskrit, Greek, and Syriac. His chronology drew on sources from across the ancient world: Mesopotamian, Persian, Indian, Jewish, and Christian, and attempted to create a unified chronological framework for all of human history. Within that framework, al-Biruni included detailed references to the Apkallu tradition. He described the 7 sages as masters of antediluvian sciences, beings who possessed knowledge of astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and metallurgy that had been passed down through a chain of transmission extending from the time before the flood to his own era. What is notable about al-Biruni's account is how closely some of its details correspond to what scholars would later find in the cuneiform record. Writing centuries before the decipherment of cuneiform, before anyone in the modern world could read a single Sumerian tablet, al-Biruni appears to have had access to transmission chains that preserved key elements of the Apkallu tradition with considerable fidelity. He knew the general number and role of the sages, their association with the flood, and their function as preservers of knowledge. How much of this came from intermediary sources, Persian, Syriac or Arabic translations of older material, and how much was embellished or reinterpreted along the way, we cannot say with certainty. But the correspondence is suggestive of a remarkably durable chain of transmission. How? The answer is the long transmission. The knowledge encoded in the Apkallu tradition did not simply disappear when the cuneiform cultures declined. It was carried forward, through Aramaic translations, through Persian scholarly traditions, through the Greek writings of Berossus and his commentators, through Jewish mystical literature, through the libraries of the early Islamic world. The chain was imperfect. Links were lost, distorted, reinterpreted, but it held. And when European scholars began to excavate the tells of Mesopotamia in the 19th century, they found, to their astonishment, that the ancient text confirmed many of the details that had been passed down through these literary intermediaries. Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, writing in the 11th century, referenced antediluvian medical knowledge attributed to primordial sages in his monumental Book of Healing. Abd al-Rahman al-Sufi, in his Book of Fixed Stars, incorporated Babylonian astronomical records while extending them with his own observations, continuing a tradition of celestial measurement that stretched back to the time of the Apkallu. The Renaissance brought another wave of engagement. Marsilio Ficino, who translated the Corpus Hermeticum in the 1460s, it was published in 1471, connected Egyptian Hermetic traditions with what he understood of Mesopotamian elements, constructing a Prisca Theologia, a primordial theology, that linked the wisdom traditions of the ancient world into a single chain. Pico della Mirandola, in his famous Oration on the Dignity of Man, invoked Chaldean wisdom traditions as part of the foundation of human knowledge. These Renaissance thinkers did not have access to cuneiform tablets. They were working from the same secondary and tertiary sources that had preserved the tradition through the medieval period. But their instinct was sound. There was a chain, there was a transmission, and it reached back further than any of them realized. When Henry Rawlinson and Georg Friedrich Grotefend finally cracked the cuneiform script in the mid-19th century, and when Layard and Rassam and Smith began pulling tablets from the ruins of Nineveh, they were not discovering something new. They were completing a circle. They were finding the source of a river that had been flowing, underground and above ground, through every century since the last cuneiform scribe laid down his stylus. There is an aspect of the Apkallu tradition that deserves more attention than it usually receives. It is not dramatic. It is not mysterious in the way that fish-cloaked beings rising from the sea are mysterious. But it may be the most important part of the entire story. The Apkallu did not merely appear and demonstrate knowledge, the way a magician performs a trick. According to the tradition, they established institutions. They created schools. They trained students. They built systems for the transmission of knowledge that would outlast any single teacher, even an immortal one. The archaeological evidence from Eridu and other early Sumerian cities supports this. The temple complexes that Safar and Lloyd uncovered were not simply places of worship. They were centres of learning. The administrative records found within them suggest organised programs of instruction, not the informal passing of skills from parent to child, but deliberate systematic teaching. By the time we reach the well-documented scribal schools of the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC, the Edub Bay, or tablet houses, we can see the descendants of this institutional tradition in full flower. Students in these schools underwent years of rigorous training. They began with basic sign lists, progressing to mathematical exercises, astronomical observations, and eventually the composition of literary and religious texts. They copied the same texts, in the same sequence, at schools separated by hundreds of miles. The curriculum was standardized, and at the top of that curriculum, At the origin point of the entire system, the text placed the Apkallu. At Nippur, one of the most important educational centres of ancient Sumer, excavations recovered tens of thousands of practice tablets, the scribbled exercises of students learning their craft. Among these tablets are texts that explicitly reference the Apkallu as the original source of the knowledge being transmitted. The scribal tradition did not claim to have invented its own methods. It claimed to have inherited them from the sages from the beginning. This institutional dimension of the Apkallu tradition is crucial because it transforms the myth from a story about supernatural beings into a story about education, about the idea that knowledge must be organized, structured, and deliberately passed from one generation to the next, that it is not enough to know something. You must build a system for ensuring that others will know it too long after you're gone. The Sumerians understood this with a clarity that is almost startling. They knew that knowledge stored only in human minds is fragile. One death, one disruption, one generation that fails to learn, and centuries of accumulated wisdom can vanish. So they invented writing. Not for poetry, not for storytelling. Writing was invented as a technology of preservation, a way to freeze knowledge in time, to make it independent of any single human brain. And they attributed this invention, this most consequential of all human technologies, to the sages. The educational practices described in cuneiform texts suggest a sophisticated understanding of pedagogy. Students were selected based on aptitude. They were assigned to specific masters. Their progress was evaluated through practical exercises. Those who excelled were given increasing responsibility, copying more complex texts, performing calculations with higher stakes, eventually becoming teachers themselves. Some texts appear to describe advanced students or practitioners as sons of Adapa, a phrase that, if this reading is correct, would explicitly link the educational tradition to the first sage. To be a son of Adapa would not have been a claim of biological descent. It would have been a claim of intellectual lineage. It would have meant, I have been trained in the tradition that began with the first teacher. I carry his knowledge. I am part of the chain. This idea, that intellectual lineage is as real and as important as biological lineage, is one of the most profound contributions of Mesopotamian thought to human civilization. We still live within it. Every academic tradition, every professional certification, every system of apprenticeship and mentorship traces its conceptual DNA back to this insight, that knowledge has a pedigree, and the pedigree matters. The schools of Eridu may not survive in the archaeological record with the clarity we would wish. The mud brick buildings of the earliest periods have largely dissolved back into the earth from which they were made. But the tradition they established, the tradition of organized education, of deliberate knowledge transmission, of institutional learning, that tradition has never stopped. It has transformed, migrated, adopted new languages and new technologies, but it has never broken. From the tablet houses of Nippur to the academies of Athens to the universities of medieval Europe to the classrooms and lecture halls of the modern world, the same fundamental activity continues. Someone who knows something teaches it to someone who does not. And in the Sumerian imagination, the first person to do that, the first teacher, was a figure who came from the water and carried in his hands the plans for heaven and earth. One domain of Apkallu knowledge deserves particular attention: medicine. Mesopotamian medical texts are among the most detailed and sophisticated documents of the ancient world. They describe diagnostic procedures, surgical techniques, pharmaceutical preparations and therapeutic protocols with a precision that frequently surprises modern readers. And many of these texts attribute their content, directly or indirectly, to the antediluvian sages. The Diagnostic Handbook, a compendium of medical knowledge compiled in its canonical form during the first millennium BC, but drawing on much older sources, begins with the physician approaching the patient's house and noting omens along the way. It then proceeds through a systematic head-to-toe examination, describing symptoms and their associated conditions in a sequence that bears a striking resemblance to the review of systems used in modern clinical medicine. The pharmacological texts are equally impressive. Mesopotamian healers had access to a materia medica of hundreds of substances, plant extracts, mineral compounds, animal products, and combinations thereof. They prepared ointments, poultices, suppositories, fumigants, and drinkable solutions. They understood the principle of dosage. that the same substance could heal in one quantity and harm in another. They practiced distillation and extraction. They maintained gardens specifically for the cultivation of medicinal plants, and some of their preparations actually worked. Chemical analysis of compounds described in cuneiform medical texts has revealed active ingredients that modern pharmacology recognizes as genuinely therapeutic. Willowbark extract, described in several Mesopotamian recipes, contains salicylic acid, the precursor to aspirin. Honey, used extensively as a wound dressing, has well-documented antibacterial properties. Certain mineral preparations described in the texts correspond to compounds with known antiseptic or anti-inflammatory effects. The Nutsi archives, a collection of approximately 5,000 tablets found at Yorgan Tepe in northeastern Iraq, dating to the 15th and 14th centuries BC, provide a window into daily life in a Mesopotamian provincial town. Among the diverse texts in this collection, some appear to contain pharmaceutical recipes and references to ancient wisdom traditions. According to analysis of these tablets, certain medical preparations may carry attributions to the knowledge traditions of the antediluvian period, though the interpretation of these attributions remains a subject of ongoing scholarly work. This does not mean that Mesopotamian medicine was consistently effective. Much of it was intertwined with magical thinking and ritual practice. The same physician who prescribed a genuinely therapeutic plant extract might also recite an incantation to drive out the demons supposedly responsible for the illness. The boundary between what we would call medicine and what we would call religion was non-existent in the Mesopotamian worldview. The body and the spirit were not separate domains. Illness was simultaneously a physical condition and a spiritual disturbance, and treatment addressed both. But the pharmaceutical knowledge was real, and the Mesopotamians attributed it to the sages. The medical tradition also included surgical practice. Texts describe procedures for draining abscesses, setting fractures, and performing trepanation, the drilling of holes in the skull, a practice attested archaeologically at sites across the ancient world. The survival rates implied by the textual descriptions, which matter-of-factly discuss post-operative care and complications, suggest that these were not experimental procedures but established techniques with known outcomes. It is worth considering what this implies. If even a fraction of this medical knowledge traces back to a pre-Sumerian tradition, carried perhaps by the survivors of coastal communities displaced by the Gulf inundation, then the figures behind the Apkallu myth may have been, among other things, healers, keepers of a pharmacopoeia that took centuries to develop and that represented, in its own way, a technology as sophisticated as any ziggurat or canal. We cannot prove this connection, but the depth and maturity of early Mesopotamian medicine makes it a possibility worth holding. The knowledge of which plants heal and which plants harm is not something that can be invented overnight. It accumulates slowly, through observation, through trial and error, through the careful recording of outcomes across generations. A medical tradition as developed as what appears in the Mesopotamian texts implies a long history of practice, centuries at minimum. And if the Sumerians were working from a pre-existing knowledge base when they established their first cities, that would explain a great deal. The sages were healers. Remember that, if you remember nothing else tonight. They came from the water and they taught us how to mend. The other domain that demands close attention is astronomy, because Mesopotamian astronomy is, quite simply, one of the most extraordinary achievements of the ancient world, and the tradition attributed it entirely to the sages. The Babylonians tracked the movements of the planets with a precision that astonishes modern astronomers. Their observational records, the astronomical diaries maintained by temple astronomers over centuries, constitute the longest continuous scientific data set in human history. They noticed patterns that repeated over long cycles. They developed mathematical models to predict future planetary positions. They could calculate centuries in advance when eclipses would occur. The Enuma Anu Enlil, a series of approximately 70 cuneiform tablets containing celestial omens, represents one of the most comprehensive astronomical reference works of the ancient world. It correlates specific astronomical events, the rising and setting of stars, the appearance and disappearance of planets, the occurrence of eclipses, with predictions about political, social and natural events. While the omen interpretations are, by modern standards, not scientific, the astronomical observations that underlie them are extraordinarily accurate. The sexagesimal number system, base 60, made this precision possible. Where our decimal system divides the unit into tenths, hundredths, and thousandths, the sexagesimal system divides it into 60ths, 36 hundredths, and so on. 60 is a highly composite number. It is evenly divisible by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, and 60. This makes fractional calculations much easier and more precise. It is why we still divide the circle into 360 degrees, the hour into 60 minutes, and the minute into 60 seconds. Every time you look at a clock, you are using Sumerian mathematics. Babylonian astronomers also developed the concept of the zodiac, the division of the ecliptic into 12 segments, each associated with a constellation. This system was adopted by the Greeks and passed into Western astrology and astronomy, where it remains in use today. And all of this, the number system, the observational methods, the predictive algorithms, the zodiacal framework, the Mesopotamians attributed to the sages who came before the flood. The precision of their eclipse calculations is particularly remarkable. The Saros cycle, the 18-year, 11-day period after which the pattern of lunar and solar eclipses approximately repeats, was documented in Babylonian texts and demonstrates an understanding of orbital mechanics that is genuinely sophisticated. Modern astronomers have verified that the Saros cycle is real, and that Babylonian predictions based on it were accurate to within a few hours. How did they achieve this? Through observation. Centuries of painstaking, continuous, systematic observation. Night after night, year after year, generation after generation, watching the sky and recording what they saw. This is not the work of a single genius. It is the work of an institution, a culture of observation, a tradition of precision that was maintained across centuries of political upheaval, dynastic change, and military conquest. And at the foundation of that tradition, the texts say, were the Apkallu, the first astronomers, the ones who looked up at the stars and began to count. There is something deeply moving about this. The idea that the first act of science, the first deliberate, systematic attempt to understand the patterns of the natural world, was attributed not to human curiosity but to instruction from beyond. As if the Sumerians believed that the universe was too vast and too complex for human minds to have decoded on their own, as if someone had to show them where to look and how to count. And perhaps they were right, not about the divine instruction, but about the vastness, about the complexity, about the need for those who came before, because every advance in human understanding has depended on the work of predecessors, on the observations they recorded, the patterns they noticed, the tools they developed. No one reads the stars alone. Every astronomer stands on the shoulders of every astronomer who came before, and the first astronomer, the one at the bottom of the stack, the one who started the whole tradition, is lost in the mist of time. The Sumerians gave that first astronomer a name. They called him an Apkallu, and they said he came from the deep. Let that settle over you now. Somewhere above your head, whether you can see them or not, the same stars that the Babylonian astronomers tracked are turning in their ancient patterns. The same cycles are repeating. The same light is falling. And the numbers that describe those cycles, the 60ths and the 360ths, are the same numbers that a scribe pressed into wet clay 4,000 years ago, in a school that traced its lineage back to the sages of the water. Let us go back to the Gulf one more time. The Persian Gulf, as it exists today, is a relatively shallow body of water, most of it less than 50 meters deep. But it has not always been a body of water at all. During the last glacial maximum, roughly 20,000 years ago, sea levels were dramatically lower, and the Gulf was dry land, a broad green river valley watered by the combined flow of the Tigris, the Euphrates, and the Karun, emptying into the Indian Ocean through the Strait of Hormuz. As the ice sheets melted, sea levels rose, slowly at first, then, at certain points, very quickly. Marine geological research has identified periods of rapid inundation, particularly around 8,000 to 6,000 BC, when the Gulf floor was progressively drowned. The archaeological implications of this are profound. If human communities were living in the Gulf Basin during the early Holocene, and there is every reason to believe they were given the favourable conditions of a well-watered river valley, then those communities were destroyed by a slow-motion catastrophe. Their settlements were submerged, their fields were salted, their way of life was ended. The work of Robert Carter and others has begun to reveal what lies beneath the water. More than 60 submerged sites have been identified off the coast of Kuwait alone. Some of these sites show what appear to be stone foundations and ceramic remains, hints of organised settlements that were lost when the waters rose. We may be looking at the remains of communities that the rising sea erased, and the survivors of those communities, the ones who moved inland, who climbed the riverbanks, who eventually settled in the alluvial plains that would become Sumer, would have carried memories of what was lost, memories of a world beneath the waves, memories of knowledge that had been accumulated over generations in a land that no longer existed. Is this the historical kernel of the Apkallu tradition? Did the 7 sages represent the cultural memory of a pre-inundation civilization, a people who lived in the Gulf Basin before it became a gulf, who developed sophisticated technologies and knowledge systems, and whose survivors became the founders of Sumerian culture? It is a hypothesis, not a certainty. The archaeological evidence is suggestive but far from conclusive. The submerged sites are difficult to study. Underwater archaeology in the Gulf is still in its early stages, limited by political instability, funding challenges, and the sheer difficulty of working in warm, murky, shallow water with poor visibility. But the hypothesis is consistent with what we know. It explains the sudden appearance of sophisticated culture at Eridu, on a virgin sand dune, apparently without developmental predecessors. It explains the Sumerian insistence that their civilization came from the sea, not metaphorically, but literally. It explains the fish-cloaked imagery. It explains the association of the sages with the Abzu, the freshwater deep. And it turns the Apkallu from mythology into something closer to memory. Distorted, amplified, adorned with divine trappings, but rooted, perhaps, in a real experience. The experience of a people who lost their world and built a new one from the knowledge they carried in their hands and their heads. Let that idea rest with you now. Wherever you are lying, you are resting on land that was once something else. The ground beneath every city was once a forest, a seabed, a glacier, a desert. Nothing stays. Everything transforms. And the only thing that survives the transformation is what someone somewhere chose to remember. Let us look more closely at what happened at Eridu in those earlier centuries. Not the mythology, the archaeology. The 18 strata that Safar and Lloyd identified represent a continuous sequence of construction spanning more than 2,000 years, from approximately 5,400 BC to the 3rd millennium BC. The earlier structures are modest, small, single-room buildings with offering niches and fishbone debris. But by the time we reach the middle strata, the Ubaid period, roughly 5,000 to 4,000 BC, the structures have become full-fledged temples with buttressed walls, internal divisions, and standardized proportional systems. The temple at level 7 is the first that archaeologists would call monumental. It sits on a raised platform. Its walls are thick and carefully plastered. Its central hall is flanked by smaller chambers that appear to have served administrative functions. And inside those chambers, the excavators found evidence of something remarkable: organised record-keeping. These are not the earliest writing. That distinction belongs to the proto-cuneiform tablets of Uruk, dating to around 3,200 BC, but the administrative practices visible at Eridu's level 7 suggest the preconditions for writing: the counting, the categorizing, the systematic recording of goods and obligations that would eventually demand a more permanent medium than memory. And alongside the administrative evidence, there is ritual evidence: incense burners, offering bowls, painted pottery with geometric designs that recur with notable regularity, wavy lines and patterns that some researchers have suggested could represent water or aquatic motifs, though such interpretations remain open to debate. The fish bones are everywhere. At every level, in every stratum, the remains of fish dominate the material record. This is not surprising. Eridu was located near the coast of the ancient Persian Gulf, and fishing was presumably a primary subsistence activity. But the sheer abundance of fish remains, and their consistent presence in ritual contexts suggests something more than diet. Fish were sacred at Eridu. Fish were the symbol of the deep. Fish were the garment of the sages. The god of Eridu, Enki, lord of the Abzu, was himself associated with fresh water and aquatic life. His temple, the Abzu ___1__, was the spiritual centre of the city, and the tradition that the sages rose from the water to teach humanity was not a peripheral myth, but the central narrative of Eridu's identity. The city existed because the sages came. The temple existed because Enki sent them. Everything flowed from the water. There is a quietness to this story that I want you to notice. No armies, no conquests, no dramatic confrontations between gods and monsters. Just a small city by the water, growing slowly, layer by layer, building on what came before, accumulating knowledge like sediment. The revolution at Eridu was not a revolution at all. It was a process, patient, methodical, quiet, and yet what emerged from that process, over the centuries and millennia that followed, was nothing less than civilization itself. Writing, law, mathematics, astronomy, architecture, medicine. The entire apparatus of organized human society, the scaffolding on which every subsequent culture would build, all of it traced back in the Sumerian imagination to 7 figures who came from the water, who taught, who gave, and who, when their work was done, returned to the deep. One of the most evocative claims in the Apkallu tradition concerns the deliberate burial of knowledge. The idea that the sages, knowing that a catastrophe was coming, prepared sealed repositories containing the essential records of civilization, so that after the waters receded, the knowledge could be recovered and human progress could resume. This idea has a long history in Mesopotamian thought. The Sumerian composition known as the Instructions of Uruk, one of the oldest wisdom texts in the world, dating to at least 2600 BC, includes advice attributed to the father of the flood hero Ziusudra. While the surviving text focuses primarily on ethical maxims and practical advice, the broader tradition associates Uruk with systematic efforts to preserve knowledge before the flood. The Atrahasis epic describes the flood hero receiving specific instructions, not just to build a boat, but to take aboard the seed of all living things, and, in some versions, to bury tablets containing divine wisdom. And archaeological evidence, while not definitively confirming a deliberate pre-flood preservation program, does show that the ancient Mesopotamians practiced the ritual burial of important objects beneath temple foundations. Foundation deposits, carefully placed collections of inscribed objects, tools, figurines, and sometimes tablets, have been found at sites throughout Mesopotamia. These deposits were not accidental. They were deliberate ritualized acts of preservation, placed in sealed chambers with waterproofing materials, intended to endure. At Nippur, one of the most important religious centers of ancient Sumer, excavations by the University of Pennsylvania uncovered extensive collections of cuneiform tablets preserved in what appear to be deliberately sealed contexts. The tablets span a wide range of subjects: mathematical calculations, astronomical records, medical procedures, agricultural techniques, and literary compositions. Some of these texts explicitly reference the knowledge of the antediluvian sages, attributing specific formulas and procedures to named figures in the Apkallu tradition. The practice of burying knowledge, of sealing it away against future need, is not unique to Mesopotamia. The Egyptians placed texts in tombs and temple foundations. The Romans buried coins and scrolls in the foundations of buildings. Medieval monasteries preserved manuscripts through centuries of upheaval by hiding them in walls and crypts. But the Mesopotamian version of this practice carries a particular weight because it is embedded in a narrative of survival. The flood is coming. The world as we know it will end. But if we are careful, if we seal the right things in the right places, with the right prayers and the right materials, then what we know will survive. The knowledge will outlast the catastrophe, and whoever finds it, on the other side, will have the tools to begin again. This is not just a story about the past. It is a story about the future, about what we choose to save and what we allow to be lost, about the terrifying fragility of accumulated knowledge and the extraordinary lengths to which human beings will go to preserve it. Think of the Svalbard Global Seed Vault, buried in the permafrost of a Norwegian island, designed to preserve the genetic diversity of the world's food crops against any conceivable disaster. Think of the Voyager Golden Records hurtling through interstellar space with sounds and images of Earth encoded on their surfaces, sent outward into the dark on the chance that someone, somewhere, might find them and understand. These are modern acts of preservation, but the impulse behind them is ancient. It is the same impulse that drove someone in Uruk 5, 6, 7,000 years ago to wrap tablets in reed matting, seal them with bitumen, and bury them in the earth. Please remember this, the ancient voice seems to say. Please carry this forward. Please do not let it disappear. Let us pause and consider the number itself. 7. In Mesopotamia, 7 sages. In India, 7 rishis. In Greece, 7 wise men. In the Book of Enoch, the Watchers are organised into groups, but Enoch himself is the 7th in his line. In the Book of Proverbs, a biblical text deeply influenced by Mesopotamian wisdom literature, there is a verse that reads, "Wisdom has built her house. She has set up its 7 pillars." 7 planets were visible to the ancient eye: the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn. 7 days in the week, each named for one of those celestial bodies. 7 notes in the diatonic scale. 7 colours of the visible spectrum. 7 openings in the human head: 2 eyes, 2 ears, 2 nostrils, 1 mouth. The ancient world was fascinated by 7. It appeared in ritual, in architecture, in theology, in astronomy. It was considered the number of completeness, the number that contained within it the full range of experience and knowledge. Why? The honest answer is that we do not fully know. The association of 7 with completeness may have astronomical origins. The 7 visible planets were the most prominent features of the night sky, and their movements governed the calendar, the agricultural cycle, and the practice of divination. Or it may have deeper roots, in the structure of human cognition itself, in the way our minds naturally categorize and group information. The psychologist George Miller published a famous paper in 1956 titled "The Magical Number 7 ± 2", arguing that the capacity of human short-term memory is approximately 7 items. We can hold about 7 things in our minds at once. Beyond that, we need to chunk, to organize, to create systems. Perhaps the 7 sages are the original act of chunking. All the knowledge of civilization sorted into 7 domains, assigned to 7 figures, each one a container for a vast and complex body of learning that would otherwise overflow the bounds of any single human mind. Or perhaps there is something else going on, something that the ancient world understood about the number 7 that we have forgotten. You do not need to solve this tonight. Let the number sit with you. 7. It is a warm number, a complete number, a number that has been considered sacred for as long as anyone has been counting. And in the darkness where you are resting now, 7 stars turn slowly overhead, whether you can see them or not. When Ashurbanipal styled himself as one who had mastered the craft of a Dharpa, he was making a political claim. He was saying, "I am not just a king, I am a sage. I possess the knowledge that flows from the oldest source. I am connected through an unbroken chain of transmission to the very first teacher who rose from the water." This claim was not unique to Ashurbanipal. Mesopotamian kings routinely invoked the Apkallu tradition to legitimize their authority. The Sumerian king list itself, the document that traces kingship back to its descent from heaven in Eridu, is, in a sense, an Apkallu text. It says, "The institution of kingship originated in the same place, at the same time, as the institution of the sages. The two are inseparable. Wisdom and power are born together." Later kings followed this pattern. Hammurabi, in the prologue to his famous law code, invoked the wisdom of the ancient sages as the foundation of legal precedent. Sennacherib, Ashurbanipal's grandfather, wrote in his annals that Ea had endowed him with knowledge equivalent to that of the sage Adapa. Sargon II, the king whose palace at Dur-Sharrukin was lined with Apkallu reliefs, explicitly connected his construction program to the antediluvian tradition, designing his city according to principles he attributed to the wisdom of the sages. This is not simply vanity, it is a theory of a knowledge. The Mesopotamians believed that legitimate knowledge had a pedigree, that it could be traced back through named teachers and named students to an original source. The scribal schools that trained the administrators and priests of Mesopotamian society were organized along these lines. A student learned from a master. The master had learned from his master. And at the top of the chain, at the very beginning, were the Apkallu. This is, in a sense, the world's first intellectual tradition, the idea that knowledge has an author, that it comes from somewhere, that the transmission of knowledge from teacher to student is a sacred act, as important as any temple ritual or royal decree. Modern universities operate on a version of this principle. Every PhD dissertation includes a lineage, the advisor, the advisor's advisor, stretching back through generations of scholars. Every field of study has its founding figures, its canonical texts, its chain of transmission. We do not typically describe this chain in mythological terms. We do not say that the knowledge came from fish-cloaked beings who rose from the deep. But the structure is the same. Someone taught us. They learned from someone who taught them. And at the beginning, wherever the beginning is, there was a first teacher, a first moment of transmission, a first spark. The Sumerians called that spark the Apkallu, and they honoured it for 5,000 years. What were the Apkallu, really? This is the question that every serious engagement with this tradition eventually reaches, and there is no single answer. There are only possibilities, each with its own weight of evidence and its own flavour of wonder. The first possibility is that the Apkallu are purely mythological, narrative devices invented by the Sumerians to explain the otherwise inexplicable sophistication of their own culture. Every civilization needs an origin story. The Sumerians chose fish-cloaked sages and the god of the deep. The second possibility is that the Apkallu represent a cultural memory, a mythologized version of real events. Perhaps the survivors of the Gulf inundation carried knowledge from a pre-Sumerian culture into the alluvial plain of southern Mesopotamia, and that knowledge was so advanced relative to the existing populations that it seemed divine. Over centuries of retelling, the human teachers became supernatural beings, the boats became fish garments, the Gulf became the Abzu. The third possibility, and this is the one that has captured the popular imagination, for better and for worse, is that the Apkallu represent contact with an unknown civilization. Not aliens, not gods, but a technologically advanced human culture whose existence has been otherwise lost to history. A culture that, for reasons we cannot reconstruct, sent emissaries to the people of the alluvial plain and shared its knowledge with them. This is the thesis advanced, in various forms by writers like Graham Hancock, who has argued that the evidence of the ancient world points to the existence of a lost civilization, destroyed by the cataclysmic events at the end of the last ice age, whose survivors seeded the development of the historical civilizations we know. Mainstream archaeology regards this thesis with deep skepticism, and for good reasons. There is no unambiguous physical evidence of such a civilization. The submerged sites in the Persian Gulf, while intriguing, have not been sufficiently excavated to support the claim, and the development of Sumerian culture, while remarkably rapid, can be explained, at least provisionally, by the confluence of favourable environmental conditions, the domestication of key crop species, and the accumulation of incremental innovations over centuries. But skepticism is not the same as refutation, and the submerged sites remain unexcavated. The question remains open. There is also a fourth possibility, and it is perhaps the most interesting. It is the possibility that the Apkallu tradition preserves something that does not fit neatly into any of these categories, something that is not purely myth, not purely memory, not purely contact with an external civilization, but all of these at once, a layered, complex, multivalent tradition that encodes different kinds of truth at different levels. At the surface level, it is a story about fishmen rising from the sea. At the historical level, it may preserve memories of real cultural transmission. At the philosophical level, it is a meditation on the nature of knowledge itself, on where it comes from, how it is transmitted, and what is lost when the chain is broken. And at the deepest level, it is a statement about the human condition, that we are creatures who need to be taught, that we are not self-sufficient in our wisdom, that the most important things we know were given to us by something or someone beyond ourselves. All of these readings can be true simultaneously. They do not cancel each other out. They overlap, like the 18 layers of Eridu, each one built on the one below. There is one more thing I want to say before we reach the final movement of this story. It is not about the Apkallu directly. It is about what their story illuminates when you hold it up against the world you live in now. We live in an age of extraordinary knowledge. We have mapped the human genome. We have photographed black holes. We have sent robots to Mars. We carry in our pockets devices that contain more information than the Library of Ashurbanipal and the Library of Alexandria combined. We are, by any measure, the most knowledgeable civilization that has ever existed. And yet, most of us could not from scratch smelt copper. Most of us could not identify a medicinal plant in the wild. Most of us could not predict an eclipse or navigate by the stars or build a structure that would last a century. We are individually ignorant to a degree that would have astonished a Mesopotamian scribe. Our knowledge is collective, distributed, stored in systems and institutions and databases that we access, but do not fully understand. And those systems are fragile. A power outage, a server failure, a pandemic, a war. Any one of these can disrupt the flow of knowledge that we depend on for survival. We have more information than any previous civilization, but we may be less resilient. Because our knowledge is not stored in our bodies and our hands, it is stored in machines, and machines can break. The Sumerians understood this fragility. They felt it viscerally. They had experienced it, or at least they believed they had, in the flood that destroyed the world before theirs. And their response was twofold. Write it down and bury it deep. Write it down because spoken knowledge dies with the speaker. Bury it deep because even written knowledge can be destroyed by fire, flood, or time. These are still the two fundamental strategies for preserving knowledge. We write it down, in books, in databases, in code, and we bury it deep. In archives, in vaults, in the institutional memory of universities and libraries and research centres. But there is a third strategy, and the Apkallu tradition embodies it more powerfully than any other. Teach, find students, pass the knowledge on, mind to mind, hand to hand, generation to generation. Because writing can be burned and vaults can be breached. But a living tradition, a chain of teachers and students stretching across centuries, has a resilience that no physical medium can match. Think about what we have lost. The library at Alexandria, destroyed. We do not know all the knowledge that perished with it. The libraries of the ancient Maya, burned by Spanish conquistadors, entire systems of astronomy and mathematics gone. The knowledge traditions of indigenous peoples around the world, disrupted by colonization and forced assimilation. Ways of understanding plants, animals, weather, and ecosystems that took millennia to develop, scattered in a few generations. Every one of these losses was a kind of flood. Not a flood of water, but a flood of forgetting. And every one of them left the world a little poorer, a little less wise, a little more vulnerable. The Apkallu tradition is, at its heart, a story about the fear of exactly this kind of loss. It is a story about a world that knew things, extraordinary things, things it took ages to learn, and that came within a hair's breadth of losing all of it. The flood came, the waters rose, and if someone had not sealed the tablets, had not built the boat, had not carried the knowledge to the other side, then everything would have been lost. We would have had to start over from nothing. The terror of that possibility, the possibility of starting over from nothing, is the engine that drives the entire tradition. It is why the sages are revered. It is why the tablets are sealed. It is why the scribal schools exist. It is why the kings invoke the craft of Vedapa in their inscriptions. Because the knowledge is precious. Because the knowledge is fragile. Because the flood could always come again. And the flood does come again. Not always as water. Sometimes as fire. Sometimes as war. Sometimes as the slow erosion of indifference. A generation that does not learn what the previous generation knew. A tradition that fades because no one thought to write it down. A language that dies because the last speaker dies with no one to listen. The sages came to prevent this. That is their deepest function in the Mesopotamian imagination. They are not just teachers. They are guards against forgetting. They are the wall between civilization and the void. And when the era epic describes their banishment, when Marduk sends them back to the deep and says they must not return, the text describes the consequence with chilling clarity. The quality of craftsmanship declined. The images of the gods could no longer be renewed. The world grew less skilled, less wise, less connected to its own foundations. This is what the loss of a teaching tradition looks like. Not a dramatic collapse, not a sudden darkness, just a slow, quiet dimming. The gradual replacement of mastery with competence, competence with adequacy, adequacy with something barely sufficient. And then, one day, someone tries to do something that their grandparents could have done effortlessly, and they realize that the knowledge is gone, the chain is broken, the sages are in the deep and they are not coming back. Are we living in such a time? I do not know. That is not a question for a night like this, but it is a question worth holding. Before we close, there is one more figure to consider. The seventh, Apkallu, Abzu, the one who did not go back to the water. Of all the seven sages, Abzu is the most enigmatic. The Bit Meseri texts describe him simply as the one who ascended to heaven. While the other 6 returned to the Abzu, the deep, after completing their work, Abzu went up. He ascended. He left the earth entirely. We have already noted the parallel with Enoch, the 7th patriarch in the Genesis genealogy, who walked with God and was not, for God took him. The structural similarity is too precise to be ignored. The 7th figure in an antediluvian list, distinguished from the others by ascending to the divine realm rather than dying or returning to an earthly origin. But there is something else about Abzu that invites reflection. Some interpreters of the tradition have suggested that as the final sage, the last before the flood, he may have played a role in ensuring that the accumulated knowledge of the previous 6 sages would survive the coming catastrophe. The cuneiform texts themselves do not spell this out in detail. They tell us only that he ascended. But the logic of the narrative implies it. If the sages came to give humanity knowledge, and if they knew the flood was approaching, then the last among them would have been the one charged with making sure that knowledge endured. Whether this reading is historically grounded or a later interpretive layer, the idea it contains is powerful. If the other 6 sages represent the transmission of knowledge, the act of teaching, then Abzu represents its preservation, the act of saving, of looking at what has been built and saying, this must endure, this must not be lost. And then he ascended. He went up. He did not stay to see whether the preservation worked. He trusted the system, the sealed tablets, the trained students, the buried repositories, and he departed. There is something unbearably poignant about this. The last sage, the one who made sure everything was ready, and then the one who left, who ascended to heaven and was not seen again. Did he leave because his work was done, or did he leave because he could not bear to watch the flood? We do not know. The texts do not say. They only record the ascent and then the silence. But the work held. The knowledge survived. The cities were rebuilt. The scribal schools resumed. The tradition continued. Whatever Abzu prepared, whatever he sealed and buried and entrusted to the earth, it was found and it was used, and civilization began again. The 7th sage saved the world, not through strength, not through miracles, through foresight, through planning, through the quiet, unglamorous, essential work of making sure that what mattered would be preserved. Let your mind go quiet now. We are almost at the end. Think about the last time someone taught you something you did not know. Not a fact from the internet, not a statistic or a date. Something real, a skill, a perspective, a way of seeing the world that had not occurred to you before. Maybe it was a parent showing you how to hold a tool. Maybe it was a teacher explaining a concept that suddenly made a dozen other things make sense. Maybe it was a stranger saying something in passing that stayed with you for years. That moment, the moment when knowledge passes from one mind to another, is the most human thing there is. It is the thing that makes us what we are. Every other species on Earth is born with most of what it needs to know. The bird knows how to fly, the fish knows how to swim, the spider knows how to spin a web. But a human being is born knowing almost nothing. We must be taught everything, from language to walking to the simplest acts of daily survival. And the Sumerians knew this. They felt the weight of it. They looked at the cities they had built and the writing they had invented and the stars they had learned to read, and they thought, we did not do this alone. Someone taught us. Someone came from outside our experience and showed us what was possible. Maybe that someone was a god from the deep. Maybe it was a traveller from a distant shore. Maybe it was the accumulated wisdom of 100 generations, compressed by memory into the image of a single, otherworldly teacher. It does not matter. What matters is the recognition, the humility, the understanding that knowledge is a gift, that it flows from somewhere, and that our highest duty is to receive it, preserve it, and pass it on. The 7 sages did their work. They taught, they gave, and when the work was done, they returned to where they came from. 6 went back to the water, 1 went up to the sky, and humanity was left alone with what it had learned. We have been alone with it ever since, and everything we have built, every city, every library, every hospital, every observatory, every school, is an attempt to honour what we were given, to prove that the sages' work was not in vain, that the knowledge they brought from the deep was not wasted on us. Maybe that is what civilization is. Not the buildings, not the machines, not the codes of law or the systems of government. Maybe civilization is the decision to remember, to take what was given and carry it forward, to refuse to let the waters rise over it. Maybe civilization is the sealed tablet, wrapped in reed matting and buried in the earth, waiting for someone to find it. In 1843, in the hills northeast of Mosul, a French consul broke through a layer of packed earth and found himself standing in a room that had not been entered in over 2,500 years. On the walls, silent figures stared back at him. They held their small buckets and their pine cones. They did not move. They did not speak. They had been waiting. They had been waiting for someone to come back, to brush away the dust, to look into their carved stone eyes and ask, "What were you? What did you know? What did you give us?" Botta did not yet understand what he had found. He thought, at first, that he had discovered Nineveh, the great Assyrian capital mentioned in the Bible. It would take years of further excavation and translation before scholars realized that this was Dur-Sharrukin, Sargon's fortress, a city built for eternity and occupied for barely a year, a city where Apkallu figures had been carved into every wall and buried beneath every floor, as if the king who built it feared that without their protection, the darkness would close in. And perhaps the darkness did close in. Sargon died on the battlefield. His body was never recovered. His son abandoned the city. The walls crumbled, the sand drifted in, and the Apkallu stood in the dark for 2.5 millennia, holding their buckets and their cones, performing their ritual of protection over an empty room. But they were found. That is the point. They were found. The answers are still coming. In the submerged sites of the Persian Gulf, in the sealed rooms beneath the tells, in the cuneiform tablets that continue to be discovered, translated and debated, in the long, patient work of scholars who spend their careers with magnifying glasses and dictionaries, coaxing meaning from marks pressed into wet clay 5,000 years ago. Every year, new tablets are published, new sites are surveyed, new technologies, ground-penetrating radar, satellite imagery, underwater acoustic mapping, reveal features that previous generations of archaeologists could not have detected. The story of the Apkallu is not finished. It is still being written, layer by careful layer, in the same patient manner that the sages themselves are said to have worked. And here is what moves me most about this entire tradition. Not the mystery, not the drama, not the spectacle of fish-cloaked beings rising from the deep. What moves me is the faithfulness, the sheer, stubborn, 5,000-year faithfulness of human beings to an idea. The idea that knowledge matters, that it is worth preserving, that it is worth passing on, that the first teacher, whoever that teacher was, wherever they came from, whatever form they wore, did something so important that it deserved to be remembered until the end of time. The sages came from the water. They taught humanity everything. Then they went back, and we are still here, still building, still remembering, still carrying the knowledge forward, one generation to the next, one teacher to the next, one night to the next. The circle closes, but it never ends. If this story stayed with you tonight, if even part of it lingered as you drifted, I would be grateful if you would leave a like. It helps more people find their way to this quiet place. If you want to continue, there is more waiting for you in the playlist. Other stories, other mysteries, other nights. And if something in tonight's story sparked a thought, a question, a connection, a memory of your own, leave it in the comments. This is a place where curious minds gather, and your thoughts are always welcome here. Until next time, wherever you are in the world, whatever time it is, sleep well and dream deep. Good night.